I have carried this with me for 61 years, and I have never spoken of it to anyone, not to my wife, who lies buried now these 14 years, not to my sons, who think me simple in my old age, not even to myself in the quiet moments when a man is supposed to reckon with his Maker. But I am 84 years old, and my hands shake when I hold a pen, and I know that if I do not put this down now, it will die with me, and perhaps that would be for the best. But I cannot let it go unspoken any longer. My name is Henry Albright. I was born in the spring of 1900 on a tenant farm 7 miles outside of Meridian, Oklahoma. My father worked land that was not his own, as his father had before him, and as I would do for most of my life. My mother kept the house and tended a garden that somehow produced vegetables even in the worst droughts. I was the second of 4 children. My older brother Thomas died of scarlet fever when I was 9. My younger sisters, Ruth and Mary, married and moved away before I turned 20. We were not poor by the standards of that time and place, but we were not wealthy either. We had enough to eat most days. We had a roof that did not leak too badly. We had work that kept our hands busy and our minds occupied. That is more than many had in those years, and I learned early not to ask for more than what was given. I left school after the 8th grade, as most boys did then, to work full-time on the farm. There was no shame in it. Education was a luxury for town children and the sons of men who owned their own land. I could read and write and cipher well enough for the life I would lead. My father needed me in the fields, and that was that. By the time I turned 23, I had been working the land for 9 years. I knew every acre of our section as well as I knew the lines on my own palms. I knew which fields drained poorly after rain and which held moisture through the dry spells. I knew where the plow would catch on rocks buried just beneath the surface and where the soil ran deep and black and rich. I knew the rhythm of the seasons and the smell of the earth at different times of year. In the spring of 1923, I was still living in my father's house, though I had been courting a girl from town named Catherine for nearly a year. We planned to marry that autumn, after the harvest was in. Her father had agreed to let us rent a small house on his property, and I had been saving what little money I could toward furnishing it. I remember feeling that spring that my life was finally taking shape, that I could see the outline of what it would be. I remember feeling that I understood the world and my place in it. The farm where I lived and worked sat in a shallow valley between 2 low ridges. The house was small, built of wood that had weathered to a soft gray. My grandfather had built it with his own hands in 1887. There were 4 rooms downstairs and a loft above where I slept. There was a barn that listed slightly to one side, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a well that my father said had never run dry. We kept our 2 mules there, Jasper and Belle, along with a milk cow named Daisy. The barn smelled of hay and manure and old wood, a smell so familiar to me that I barely noticed it. Beyond the yard, fields stretched in all directions. We had approximately 160 acres under cultivation, though only about half was planted in any given year. My father rotated the crops carefully. Wheat one year, corn the next, then hay, then fallow. Our nearest neighbors, the Hutchinsons, lived a mile and a half to the east. To the west, There was nothing but open land for 3 miles until you reached the county road. It was a lonely place in some ways, but I had known no other life, and the loneliness did not trouble me. My days followed a pattern that varied little from season to season. I woke before dawn and did the morning chores, fed the livestock, milked the cow, collected eggs. By the time I finished, the sun would be coming up, and my mother would be calling us in for breakfast. We ate at the kitchen table, fried eggs and potatoes, bread and butter. My father read from the Bible while we ate. After breakfast, I went to whatever field needed working that day. In the spring, that meant plowing and planting. In the summer, cultivating and weeding. In the fall, harvesting. I worked until the light began to fail, then did the evening chores in reverse. In the evenings, I ate supper with my family. Sometimes I read by lamplight. Sometimes I sat on the porch and listened to the sounds of the night. Crickets and frogs and the occasional distant call of a coyote. Once or twice a week, if there was time, I walked into town to see Catherine. It was a walk of about 40 minutes. I would arrive at her father's house just as the sun was setting, and we would sit together on the porch swing and talk about our plans for the future. Catherine was the daughter of a shopkeeper, and she had been educated through the 10th grade. She could quote poetry and play the piano. She wanted our house to have real wallpaper. She wanted a parlor where we could entertain guests. She wanted our children to go to school for as long as possible. I loved listening to her talk about these things. I loved the way her eyes lit up when she described the life we would have together. On Sundays, we went to church. The whole family loaded into our wagon and made the journey into town. The church was a white wooden building with a tall steeple. We sat in the same pew every week, about halfway back on the right side. After the service, we stood outside and talked with the other families. It was a simple life, and I expected it to continue in much the same way for as long as I lived. I expected to marry Catherine and raise children and work the land and grow old. I expected the world to remain comprehensible, predictable, governed by rules I understood. I remember that sense of certainty very clearly, the feeling that life, however hard, made sense, that there was an order to things, and that I knew what that order was. I remember believing that I understood the nature of reality. I remember feeling safe. It was a Tuesday in early April. I remember that because Catherine's birthday was that Thursday, and I had been planning to go into town to see her. The weather had been warm for 3 days straight, warm enough that my father said we could start plowing the north field. I woke that morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. The sky outside my window was the pale gray blue of early dawn. I dressed in my work clothes, denim trousers, a cotton shirt, boots that were coming apart at the seams, and went downstairs. My mother was at the stove, frying eggs and potatoes. My father sat at the table drinking coffee and looking at an almanac. My sister Mary was setting out plates. It was an ordinary morning. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt wrong. We ate breakfast without much conversation. My father said he wanted me to finish plowing the north field if I could, and to check the fence along the western edge because he had seen cattle wandering near it the day before. I said I would. Mary asked if I would bring her a blue ribbon from town. I said I would try. After breakfast, I walked out to the barn and hitched Jasper to the plow. The sun was just coming up over the eastern ridge, and the air was cool and still. I could hear birds singing in the trees near the house. I could smell the earth, dark and damp from a rain 2 nights before. I led Jasper out to the north field and began to plow. The work was hard but familiar. The plow bit into the soil and turned it over in long, dark furrows. Jasper pulled steadily, and I walked behind, guiding the plow and watching the ground ahead. The sun climbed higher. The air grew warmer. I fell into the rhythm of the work, the repetitive motion that allowed my mind to wander, while my body did what it had been trained to do. I thought about Catherine. I thought about the house we would rent and the furniture we would need. I thought about the wheat we would plant in this field and what the harvest might bring. I did not think about anything unusual. I did not feel that anything was about to change. I had been plowing for perhaps 3 hours when I stopped to let Jasper rest and to drink from the canteen I had brought with me. The sun was high now, beating down on my head and shoulders, and I was sweating through my shirt. I wiped my face with my sleeve and looked out across the field, measuring how much work I had left to do. It was then that I noticed the silence. I did not notice it all at once. It crept up on me slowly, the way a change in temperature does. But once I became aware of it, I could not unnotice it. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had stopped their droning. Even the wind, which had been blowing lightly from the west all morning, seemed to have died away completely. The world had gone absolutely quiet. I stood there listening, trying to understand what had changed. My heart had begun to beat faster, though I did not yet know why. There was something wrong in the quality of that silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of a still afternoon. It was something else, something that made the hair on my arm stand up. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a dust devil. We got them sometimes in the spring. Small whirlwinds that would spin across the fields and then dissipate. But this was not moving like a dust devil. It was moving too slowly, too deliberately, and it was not stirring up dust. It was just there, at the far western edge of the field, near the tree line. It looked like a column of air that was somehow thicker than the air around it, like the heat shimmer you see rising from a road in summer, except it was not rising. It was standing upright, perhaps 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was moving toward me. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking the sun had been too bright, that I was seeing things that were not there. But when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, still moving toward me. I stood perfectly still and watched it come. There was no sound, no wind, no disturbance of the earth or the grass. It simply moved across the field in my direction, slowly and steadily, like something walking, like something that had purpose and intention. I felt my heart begin to pound in my chest. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mouth had gone dry. I wanted to move, to run, to do something, but I could not. I stood frozen watching this thing approach. When it was perhaps 30 feet away from me, it stopped. We stood there, facing each other, if facing is the right word for what was happening. I could see it clearly now, or rather, I could see the space where it was. It was like looking at a column of water, transparent but visible, because it bent the light differently than the air around it. I could see the trees behind it, but they were distorted, wavering, as if I were looking at them through old glass or through water. The thing had no features that I could discern, no face, no limbs, no eyes. But despite this, I could feel it observing me, and then I felt it looking at me. I cannot explain how I knew this. It had no eyes, it had no face, but I felt its attention on me as clearly as I have ever felt anything in my life. It was studying me, observing me, and in that moment I understood, though I could not have said how, that I was not supposed to be seeing it, that this was not meant for human eyes. The thing stayed perfectly still, and I stayed perfectly still, and time seemed to stretch out between us. I could feel my own heartbeat fast and hard, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my skin, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me. And I could feel something else, something that I had no words for then and have no words for now. A presence, an awareness, an intelligence that was completely foreign, completely other. It was not hostile exactly, but it was not friendly either. It was simply there, vast and incomprehensible, looking at me the way a man might look at an insect he had discovered beneath a rock. I do not know how long we stood there. It might have been seconds. It might have been minutes. Time felt strange, stretched out, and compressed at the same time. My legs were shaking, my hands were shaking, but I could not look away. But at some point, the thing began to move again. It drifted slowly to the right, circling around me, staying the same distance away. I turned to keep it in view, moving carefully, afraid that any sudden motion would provoke some kind of reaction. And as I turned, I saw that there were others, 3 more of them, standing at different points around the field, all the same height, all the same shimmering, transparent appearance, all perfectly still, except for the one that was circling me. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a fear so deep and primal that it was almost paralyzing. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. I wanted to run, but my legs would not obey me. I could only stand there and watch as the thing completed its circle and stopped where it had started, 30 feet away from me. And then, all at once, all 4 of them began to move. Not toward me, but away, drifting back across the field in different directions. They moved slowly, silently, like smoke, drifting on a breeze that I could not feel. Within moments, they had disappeared into the tree line and the tall grass at the edges of the field. And just like that, the silence broke. The birds started singing again. The insects resumed their droning. The wind picked up, rustling the grass and the leaves. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except that I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. Jasper, who had been standing perfectly still throughout all of this, suddenly tossed his head and brayed as if waking from a trance. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were trembling. I looked out across the field, but there was nothing there, no shimmer, no distortion of light, nothing to indicate that what I had just seen had been real. But I knew it had been real. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Something had been here, something that should not exist, and it had seen me, just as I had seen it. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. My mind kept circling back to the same questions over and over. What were those things? Where had they come from? Why had they been here in this field at this moment? And most importantly, what did they want? but I had no answers. I had nothing but the memory of what I had seen and the sick, hollow feeling in my stomach. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I unhitched Jasper from the plow with hands that shook so badly I could barely manage the buckles. I led him back toward the barn, walking slowly, my legs feeling weak and unsteady beneath me. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my skin, making me shiver despite the warmth of the day. As I walked, I kept looking around, half expecting to see those things again. But the field was empty. The world looked exactly as it always had. Ordinary, unremarkable, safe, except that I knew it was not safe. I knew that there were things in this world that I did not understand, and that those things had been here, in this place where I had lived and worked all my life. When I reached the barn, I put Jasper in his stall and stood there in the dim, dusty light, trying to steady my breathing. I could hear my mother moving around in the house, the familiar sounds of dishes being washed and put away. I could hear the chickens clucking in their coop. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be, except that I was not the same. I thought about going inside and telling my father what I had seen. I imagined the words coming out of my mouth. There were things in the north field, 4 of them, like columns of air. They were watching me. But even as I imagined saying it, I knew how it would sound. I knew what my father would say. He would tell me I had been out in the sun too long. He would tell me I had imagined it. He would tell me to drink some water and rest and not to speak foolishness. And maybe he would be right. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the heat and the bright sun and the monotony of the work had played a trick on my mind. But I did not believe that. I knew what I had seen. I stood there in the barn for a long time, wrestling with the question of what to do. Should I tell someone? Should I try to find out what those things were? Should I go back to the field and look for some kind of evidence? But what evidence could there be? The things had left no tracks, no marks, no trace of their passage. They had been there, and then they had not been there, and I had nothing to show for it except my own shaken certainty. And so, finally, I made a decision. I would not tell anyone. I would keep it to myself. I would go on with my life as if nothing had happened. And maybe, in time, I would be able to convince myself that it had not been real. I went into the house and washed my hands at the sink. My mother asked me if I had finished the plowing, and I said no, that I had not been feeling well and had decided to come in early. She looked at me with concern and put her hand on my forehead, checking for fever. I told her I was fine, that I just needed to rest. She made me sit down and drink a glass of water, and then she went back to her work. My father was out in one of the other fields and would not be back until evening. Mary was upstairs in her room. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to calm the shaking in my hands, but I could not convince myself that it had not been real, not then, and not in all the years that followed. I went back to work the next day. I finished plowing the north field, though I kept my eyes on the tree line the entire time, and I did not let Jasper rest in the spot where the things had appeared. Every few minutes I would stop and scan the edges of the field, looking for that telltale shimmer in the air. My hands were tense on the plow handles. My shoulders ached from the constant tension. I checked the fence along the western edge, as my father had asked me to do. I found 3 places where the wire had come loose from the posts, and I spent the afternoon repairing them, driving new staples into the wood, pulling the wire tight. But even as I worked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see one of those things watching me from the trees. I went into town on Thursday and gave Catherine the ribbon I had bought for her birthday. It was blue, as Mary had wanted, though I had forgotten to buy one for my sister. Catherine thanked me and kissed my cheek, and we sat together on her porch and talked about the wedding and about the house we would live in. But even as I sat with her, even as I held her hand and listened to her voice, part of my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about what I had seen. I kept wondering if it would happen again. I did everything I was supposed to do. I said nothing to anyone. But the silence inside me grew heavier with each passing day. I kept thinking about what I had seen. I kept trying to find an explanation for it, some way to fit it into the world as I understood it. Had I witnessed some natural phenomenon that science had not yet explained? Had I seen something from another world, another dimension? Were those things spirits or demons or something else entirely? But there was no explanation. There was no framework for what I had witnessed. It existed outside of everything I had been taught, everything I believed. The preacher had never mentioned anything like this in his sermons. The books I had read contained no accounts of such things. And yet I had seen them. I had felt their presence. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I could never tell anyone, because who would believe me? My father, a practical man who trusted only what he could touch and measure, would think I had lost my mind. He would worry that I was unfit for work, that I could not be trusted with the farm's labor. My mother, a woman of deep faith who saw God's hand in everything, would tell me I had seen demons or angels, and neither explanation felt right. These things had not seemed evil. They had not seemed holy. They had simply been there, observing, existing. Catherine, who I loved and who loved me, would worry that I was unwell, and that worry would come between us. She would look at me differently. She would wonder if the man she was planning to marry was sound in his mind. Her father might even forbid the marriage if he thought I was afflicted with some kind of mental illness. I thought about telling the preacher, Reverend Matthews, a kind man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had baptized me when I was a child. But what would I say? That I had seen something in a field that I could not explain? He would tell me to pray about it and to trust in the Lord's wisdom. He would tell me that God works in mysterious ways and that not everything is meant to be understood by mortal minds. And maybe that would have been good advice, but it did not feel sufficient. So I stayed silent. I told myself that the things had gone away, that they had moved on to wherever they came from, and that I would never see them again. I told myself that what I had seen was a single, isolated incident, a strange moment that would fade with time, like a half-remembered dream. But I was wrong. 3 days after the incident in the North Field, I saw one of them again. I was walking back to the house at dusk, carrying a bucket of water from the well. The sun had just set, and the sky was the deep blue-purple of early evening. The first stars were beginning to appear, and the air was cool and still. I was thinking about supper and about whether I would have time to write a letter to Catherine before bed. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the yard, near the chicken coop. The same shimmering column of air, the same height, the same terrible sense of presence. I stopped walking. The bucket slipped from my hand and hit the ground, water spilling out across the dirt. I stared at the thing, and it stared back at me, or at least I felt that it was looking at me, though it had no eyes. My heart was hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, I thought I might faint. It stayed there for perhaps 10 seconds, perfectly still, and then it drifted away, moving slowly toward the barn. It passed through the fence without disturbing the wire, moved across the yard without leaving footprints, and disappeared into the shadows near the barn. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding, until my mother called from the house, asking if I was all right. I picked up the bucket with shaking hands and went inside, and I told her I was fine. That I had stumbled, that was all, but I was not fine, because I understood now that the things had not gone away. They were still here, and they were following me. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding, until my mother called from the house, asking if I was all right. I picked up the bucket with shaking hands and went inside, and I told her I was fine. That I had stumbled, that was all. But I was not fine, because I understood now that the things had not gone away. They were still here, and they were following me. Over the next several weeks, I saw them 6 more times. Once in the barn while I was feeding the livestock. Once at the edge of a field I was plowing. Once near the road that led to town. Twice at dusk, standing in places where the light was failing and the shadows were deep. And once, in the middle of the night, when I woke and looked out my bedroom window and saw one of them standing in the yard, perfectly still, like a sentinel. Each time, the encounter lasted only a few moments. The things never came closer than 20 or 30 feet from me. They never made a sound. They simply appeared, observed, and then drifted away. And each time, I felt the same cold, primal fear, the same sense that I was seeing something I was not meant to see. I began to dread going outside after dark. I began to sleep poorly, waking at every small sound. I lost weight. My mother worried that I was getting sick. She made me drink tonics and eat extra portions at meals. Catherine noticed the change in me and asked if something was wrong. I told her I was tired, that the work had been hard that spring. I thought about breaking off our engagement. I thought it would be cruel to marry her when I was carrying this burden. How could I be a good husband when I was living in constant fear? How could I build a life with her when I did not even understand the nature of the world we lived in? But I could not bring myself to do it. I loved her, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. So I married her in October, as we had planned. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon at the church in town. Catherine wore a white dress that her mother had made, and I wore the only suit I owned. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, and our families and friends were there to witness it. I remember standing at the altar with Catherine at my side, saying the vows that would bind us together for the rest of our lives. I remember looking at her face and seeing the happiness there, the absolute trust and love in her eyes. And I remember thinking, I am lying to her. I am keeping something from her that will always be between us. But I said the vows anyway. I promised to love her and honor her and protect her. And I meant those promises. even if I knew I could never tell her the whole truth about who I was and what I had seen. We moved into the small house her father had rented to us, and I tried to build a life with her. I tried to be a good husband. I worked hard. I provided for her. I was gentle and kind and faithful, but I was never fully present. There was always a part of me that was elsewhere, watching for those things, waiting for them to appear, and they did appear. Not often, but often enough. I saw them perhaps once or twice a year, always at a distance, always watching. Catherine and I had 3 sons, James, William, and Robert. They were born in 1924, 1926, and 1929. I taught them to work the land just as my father had taught me. I tried to give them a good life, a stable life, but I was always afraid that they would see what I had seen. They never did, as far as I know. The things only ever appeared to me. I never told Catherine about them, not in 46 years of marriage. There were times when the weight of the secret felt unbearable. Times when I would lie awake at night beside her, listening to her breathe, and I would think about telling her everything, but I never did. I carried it alone all those years. Catherine died 14 years ago, in the winter of 1970. She had a stroke while hanging laundry in the yard, and she was gone before the doctor could arrive. One moment she was there, pinning sheets to the line, and the next moment she was lying in the snow, her eyes open and unseeing. I found her there when I came in from the barn. I knelt beside her and held her hand, and I knew she was gone. I buried her in the cemetery outside of town next to the graves of her parents. The preacher said words about eternal rest and the promise of resurrection, but I barely heard him. I stood there in the cold with my sons beside me, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. After she died, I moved in with my youngest son, Robert, and his family. They have a house in town, a nice place with indoor plumbing and electric lights and all the modern conveniences that Catherine and I never had. They are kind to me. They make sure I have what I need. But I know they think I am a burden, an old man who has outlived his usefulness. Maybe they are right. I am 84 years old now. My hands shake when I try to write. My vision is poor, even with the glasses Robert bought for me. My memory is unreliable. I forget names and dates and where I put things. Sometimes I forget what day it is or what I am supposed to be doing. But I have never forgotten what I saw in that field in April of 1923. I can still see it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The silence falling over the field, the shimmer of air at the edge of the tree line, the terrible, overwhelming certainty that I was looking at something that should not exist. I saw one of them for the last time 3 years ago in the spring of 1981. I was sitting on Robert's porch, watching the sun go down, and I saw it standing at the edge of the yard. The same shimmering column of air, the same presence. It stayed for perhaps a minute, and then it drifted away into the gathering darkness. I have not seen them since. Maybe they are gone. Maybe they have moved on to wherever they came from, or to someone else. Or maybe they are still here, watching, and I am simply too old and too blind to see them anymore. I do not know. I will never know. But I know that I cannot die without putting this down, without telling someone, anyone, what I saw, even if no one believes me. even if they think I am a foolish old man who has lost his mind. I need someone to know that this happened, that I saw what I saw, that I carried it with me alone for 61 years. I need someone to know that I was not crazy, that I did not imagine it, that it was real. I still see that first morning in my mind as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The silence falling over the field, the shimmer of air at the edge of the tree line, the terrible, overwhelming certainty that I was looking at something that should not exist. And I still feel the weight of the question I have carried all these years. What were they? Where did they come from? And why did they choose me? I have thought about it every day of my life since that April morning. I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times, looking for answers, looking for meaning. But there is no meaning. There is only what I saw and what I felt and the long silence I kept. My sons will find this after I am gone, if they bother to look through my things. They will read it, and they will think I wrote it in confusion, in the fog of old age. They will shake their heads and feel sorry for me. They will wonder if I was losing my mind in those final years, if the loneliness after their mother died had driven me to invent stories. But I am writing this while my mind is still clear, while I can still remember the shape of things. I am writing it because it is the truth, and because the truth deserves to be spoken, even if no one believes it. I do not know what those things were. I do not know why they appeared to me, or what they wanted, or where they have gone. I do not know if they were from some other world or some other dimension, or if they were something that has always been here, invisible to most people, visible only to a few unlucky souls. I do not know if they were real in the way that trees and rocks and water are real, or if they were real in some other way that I do not have words for. But I know what I saw. I know that on that Tuesday morning in April of 1923, I was plowing a field 7 miles outside of Meridian, Oklahoma, and something appeared to me that was not supposed to be there, something that watched me with an intelligence I could not comprehend, something that followed me for the rest of my life. And I know that I was not supposed to see it, that it was not meant for human eyes, that there are things in this world or alongside this world that we are not meant to know about. And I know that I have carried the weight of that knowledge alone and in silence for 61 years. That is my testimony. That is what I have never told anyone. And now, before I go, I have put it down. Make of it what you will.